Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be looking back on my reading goals for 2024, whether I achieved them or not, and also taking a look at my reading stats for the year. So the short answer to did I achieve my reading goals in 2024 or not is no. No, I did not. But I also don't mind that I didn't. And I got some of the way through some of the goals. So, that's fine. I'll link down below my original 2024 reading goals video. But before I start looking back on my reading goals, I thought I would go through some statistics from my year in reading because I always find statistics kind of interesting. So in 2024, I read 156 things. Goodreads says I read 150. I read some individual short stories that I noted in my tracker, but I didn't note on Goodreads, so I think that's where the discrepancy comes from. So 156 things over the course of 2024, which is a bit less than I read in 2023. I think I read 167 things in 2023, but still a very similar number, and that seems like a lot to read in a year, so I'm very happy with that. So on average, that is about 13 books a month, about 3 books a week, which is about what I would like to be reading, especially as I'll talk about later, I read quite a lot on audiobook. When I say 3 books a week, it's probably 2 physical books and 1 audiobook a week, which seems a good amount to me. That's what I kind of expect to read. That number doesn't include any books I read for work. I work as a freelance editor. That's just books I'm reading for fun. So of the 156 works of literature that I read in 2024, 75 of them were contemporary works of literature and 81 of them were classics. I tend to draw the line kind of around 1990, though I admit that is pretty arbitrary. I think last year my split was like slightly more towards contemporary than classics, and this year my split is slightly more towards classics than contemporary, but it is relatively even, which is how I like it. I love reading classics, I love reading modern literature, and I kind of want to read about equal amounts of both. So taking the contemporary books first, of those 75 contemporary works of literature, 57 of them were novels, 9 of them were works of non-fiction. I read 4 works of poetry, 2 short story collections, 1 individual short story, 1 comic book, and 1 graphic novel. Didn't read any contemporary plays this year. It's interesting because I feel like this year I read quite a lot of plays and quite a lot of short story collections, but all the plays and the vast majority of the short story collections were classics, which is interesting. But anyway, I also feel like to say that I read 9 works of non-fiction this year isn't really accurate, because I read a lot of non-fiction for historical research for writing my novels, but because when I do that I don't tend to read books cover to cover, I don't like track them in the same way, so I think only one of the books that I read for historical research did I count in those 9, because I did read that book cover to cover, but I must have read bits of another like 20 books, but I didn't track them, and it doesn't really matter anyway, does it? So anyway, moving on. If I look at those 75 contemporary books by country, 54 of them were by authors from the UK, 10 of them were by authors from the USA, 5 of them were by authors from Japan, 4 by authors from Australia, 3 by authors from Ireland, 2 by authors from Canada, and I also read 1 book each by an author from China, Malaysia, Trinidad and Tobago, Peru and Zanzibar. And if those numbers add up to more than 75, which I'm pretty sure they do, that's because if an author was, say, born in one country but now lives in another country, I tend to just count them for both countries. Then when I turn to my 81 classics that I read in 2024, as I said, when I use the term classics here, I just mean a book published before 1990. I just mean an old book. I don't mean a canonical book or any of that kind of stuff. I'll leave a video link down below from at some point in 2024 where I talked about kind of what classics are and how people use that term, but when I use the term classics, I tend to just mean old books. Anyway, of the 81 old books that I read in 2024, 51 of them were novels or novellas. Some of them were definitely novellas. Anyway, I read 13 classic short story collections and 6 individual short stories, 8 plays, 2 works of poetry and 2 works of non-fiction. And in terms of the time period split, I read 1 book from before the 18th century, 1 book from the 18th century, 50 books from the 19th century and 30 books from the 20th century. There was 1 short story anthology that crossed the 19th and the 20th century, which is why that adds up to 82, not 81. So yes, I did read majority from the 19th century. Nobody is surprised about that, are they? And then in terms of the countries I read from for my classics, I read 60 British classics, 6 of which were from before the Victorian period, 38 of which were from during the Victorian period. There were 10 from 1900 to 1950 and 4 from like after. And there were also 2 short story anthologies I read that kind of crossed various time periods. Can't remember how I counted them when I did these statistics earlier, but anyway, I also read 4 Irish classics, 3 US classics, 3 Canadian classics, 3 Nigerian classics. I also read 2 classics from the Philippines, 2 classics by Indian authors, and 1 classic each by an author from Australia, France, Russia, Sweden, Zimbabwe, and ancient Greece. And I also read 1 modern classic short story from Jamaica. That was a lot of numbers, wasn't it? But I'm not done with the numbers yet, because I also wanted to have a look at the formats I read in 2024. So 73 out of my 156 books were books that I physically owned. 18 books were library books or borrowed books, books I'd borrowed from friends. 9 were ebooks, and 56 were audiobooks, which is interesting because in 2023, I think I read 43 audiobooks. So I read quite a lot more audiobooks in 2024. And that means that audiobook reading in 2024 took up like more than a third of my reading, which is really nice and is not a surprise for me. I really love audiobooks. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. As someone who works as a freelance editor for my day job, like I spend a lot of time looking at words on a page. So sometimes it is quite nice to be listening to those words rather than reading them. If I have been proofreading all day and I pick up a physical book, I do like automatically go into proofreading mode sometimes and spot errors in a way that's really frustrating, and sometimes takes me out of the story. Sometimes I can switch it off, but sometimes I just can't. Whereas when I listen to an audiobook, I'm never in editing mode ever, and that's really lovely. I listen to audiobooks while I'm exercising, while I'm cooking, while I'm baking, doing housework, whatever, and it's just a really nice way to like work reading into other areas of your life. I read quite a lot of new releases in 2024, so I read 31 books that were published in 2023, 15 that were published in 2024, and 1 forthcoming 2025 release. So that means like around 30% of my reading was new releases, which again, I'm relatively happy with. That seems like a good number to me. 77 books I read were by women, 73 were by men, and I also read 3 books by non-binary authors and 3 books that were anthologies from various different authors. That's a pretty even gender split, which seems fine to me. 114 of the books I read were by British authors, and out of the 42 books I read that were not by British authors, I read works from 21 different countries. I've discussed which countries already in this video, so that is 73% British books, which is more than I would like. I was looking back at my stats for 2023 and I read slightly less internationally in 2024 than I did in 2023, which was definitely not the way round I would like it to be. So that's quite disappointing. I definitely want to try and read more internationally in 2025. That's going to be like a bigger goal for 2025, which I'll talk about later this week probably when I do my 2025 reading goals video. I feel like I need to make more of an effort to read more internationally in 2025. Related to that, in 2024 I only read 12 books in translation, so only 8% of my reading was in translation, which is less than the year before, and I think less than the year before that as well. So that again is a shame and something I want to look at and try and rework in my reading in 2025, because I do want to read more internationally and I do want to read more in translation, and I feel like that kind of just fell by the wayside in 2024. 30.5 of the books I read were by authors of colour, 0.5 being for a short story anthology. That's about 20%, which is pretty similar to last year, probably slightly lower than I'd like. And then 30.5 books, again 20% were rereads. The half a book is for a short story anthology where I'd read half the things before and not the other half. So that is quite a bit higher than my reread figure for last year, and it's a very high like reread figure for me. I don't feel like 20% of my reading should be rereads. I love rereading, but 20% is quite a lot. However, a third of those rereads were Dickens books for the Mega Dickens read along and then the Christmas Dickens read along. So I will not be rereading as much in 2025 because I will not be rereading, you know, half of Dickens's body of work. I'm sure I will reread some books in 2025, and I do love rereading, especially on audiobook, but I don't really want rereading to be 20% of my reading. That seems like too big a figure for me. Taking a proper look at my sort of overarching goals for 2024, I had a few non-reading goals that were related to reading and then some actual reading goals. So my 2 related goals, one was to watch more screen adaptations of books, which I definitely did not do in 2024. I'm sure I watched some screen adaptations of books, but very few. I really failed this goal in 2024. My other sort of non-reading goal though was to sort out how I watch BookTube and kind of rebalance audiobooks versus BookTube, try and watch more kind of current videos as they're made, which I really feel like I did achieve in 2024. There are a lot of videos in like January that I want to watch, so my watch later playlist is feeling quite big right now, but this is like the first time in a year that it has felt unmanageable, so definitely feeling much like happier with the way I watch BookTube. And even though I listened to a lot of audiobooks in 2024, I also feel like I watched a lot of YouTube, and I kept on top of my like BookTube subscriptions and, you know, watched a lot of videos that I really enjoyed from a lot of people whose videos I really like. So I'm feeling happy with my BookTube watching. I feel like I've gotten onto a better footing with that, and I will continue to carry on watching a lot of BookTube and enjoying people's channels in 2025. So moving on to my actual reading goals for 2024. Every year I set my Goodreads reading challenge at 100 books, and I kind of always expect to read more than that. As I said, I read 156 things in 2024. I think probably I'm just gonna strike this off my like reading goals for 2025, because actually it's not really a challenge or a goal. I know that I will read over 100 books in a year. I kind of only set my Goodreads challenge like out of habit. The second challenge though, my second main reading goal of 2024 was to get my physical TBR under control. At the start of 2024, my physical TBR was at 54 books, and I said I would like to get it down to 20 books, which definitely did not happen. My TBR jar stood at 47 books at the beginning of 2024, and I said I wanted to get it down to 10 books, and I didn't, but I did better here. So my TBR jar now contains 19 titles, which is, you know, a smaller number than 47, but is not a smaller number than 10. But I am relatively happy with the progress I made with this year. That seems fine. However, when it comes to my physical TBR, it is not under 20 books. So before Christmas, I had 46 books on my TBR, and then I have got quite a few books for Christmas and also bought some books with some Christmas vouchers. So my physical TBR now in January 2025 stands at 62 books, which is, you know, not only more than 20, but also more than 54. However, I kind of don't mind that too much. I feel like maybe I should just accept that my TBR will forever be around the 50 books mark. 62 is quite high, but like that's because I've got an influx of books around Christmas that won't happen again. Like I'll probably read quite a few books from my physical TBR before I acquire any more, so I'm not too worried about my physical TBR being at 62. I'm more concerned about the books that have been on my TBR for a really long time that never get read. So I think I'm going to do something slightly different with my TBR goal in 2025, but you know, I'll talk about that in my 2025 goals video. Basically, that's a long way of saying I failed this goal in 2024, but I also don't mind that I failed, and that's fine. Then I also have my long-term Victorian literature TBR, a list of 35 books that I wanted to read across 2024 and 2025. I'll leave a video of this list linked down below. So I read 10 of those 35 books in 2024, which is, you know, not half of 35. And I said I wanted to read them all across 2024 and 2025. So I'm less than a third of the way through, but again, I kind of really don't mind about that. It's not like I didn't read lots of Victorian literature in 2024. I did. I just happened to read other Victorian books that were not the Victorian books I'd specifically picked out in December 2023. And that's fine. I do really want to read all the books on that list, and I will at some point, but if it takes me till 2027 to get through that long-term Victorian literature TBR, that is absolutely fine. So again, a long way of saying I failed this goal that I don't mind. Another reading goal for 2024, which is kind of a rolling goal, I suppose, in some ways, although really all of my reading goals don't really change that much from year to year. I just sort of shift focus, I suppose. Anyway, another reading goal for 2024 was to read more diversely, partly in terms of reading more by authors of colour, but especially in terms of reading more internationally. I said at the start of 2024 that I would like 15% of my reading to be books in translation, and that I would like to read from more than 25 countries. As you may have figured from my stats earlier on in the video, I did not achieve that. So I read books by authors from 21 countries, which, you know, is not 25, but is not that far away. I'm not super unhappy about that, but I only read 8% in translation, which I am sad about. So basically, the last two goals I was just talking about. I failed those goals and I really don't mind, but this goal I failed and I really do mind. So I definitely want reading more internationally to be like a bigger focus in 2025, which again, I'll talk about later on in the week. I think basically for me, like reading goals are always for fun. Like I never really mind if I don't achieve a goal. They're always just there for a fun challenge because I like to gamify my reading. I find that really enjoyable. And also it sometimes lends a focus to my reading, which I like, but I do feel like in 2025 I want to focus my goals a bit more and be aware of like which goals are actually a priority and which goals are just like a fun challenge that I don't really mind about, if that makes sense. So having looked at my kind of big overarching goals, let us turn to my crazy goals spreadsheet, which I really enjoy and I know quite a lot of you enjoy. I know some people find this kind of spreadsheet very stressful. Personally, for me, it's a really fun way of, as I said, gamifying my reading. So let's have a look at my goals spreadsheet for 2024. Very, very messy and scribbly when I hold it up on the screen, but I will take a photograph of it and put it up digitally as well so you can have a better look at it. So when we come to Victorian classics, I did pretty well here. There's only a few gaps in my checklist. Read all the books that I wanted to for the Mega Dickens read along, and in fact read several more for the Christmas Dickens read along. Reread some Victorian books. I only read 4 out of my planned 6 Anthony Trollope books, but I did read half an Anthony Trollope book in December that I have now finished in January, so I don't really mind that I didn't get further on with that goal, and I will be reading a lot of Anthony Trollope in 2025. And then when it comes to other Victorian reads, there are 2 gaps, but that's not the end of the world. I didn't manage to finish off Barney the Vampire, which I have been reading for most of 2024, and I'm still reading, and I hope I will finish very soon in 2025, but we will see. When it comes to British non-Victorian classics, ticked off everything between 1900 and 1950, couple of gaps in the other time periods, but I don't really mind about that. There's not very many. I'm pretty happy with that overall. With my non-British international classics, I didn't do so well, and I am sadder about this. As I said, I want reading internationally to be a bit more of a focus in 2025. I didn't manage to read 4 books from Canada, Nigeria, and the Philippines. I did read 3 from Canada and 3 from Nigeria, and I read 2 from the Philippines, and again, as with the Anthony Trollope book, I got halfway through another classic from the Philippines in December, didn't manage to finish it off by the end of 2024, have now finished it off. So, you know, I very nearly had another box ticked off there, but December was just busier than I anticipated. That's fine. But I would like to read more international classics in 2025, and that's going to be a bigger focus for me next year. Moving down my goals spreadsheet, when it comes to modern historical fiction, I ticked off all of the boxes. Of course I did. I read a lot of historical fiction and I love it very much. When it comes to other modern fiction, I have ticked off many boxes here. When it comes to rom-coms, crime and mystery books and other things, I read, you know, nearly as much as I wanted to, but I am disappointed that I only read 1 work of science fiction or fantasy this year, and that was The Mars House by Natasha Pulley as well, which was a work of science fiction, but by an author who usually writes historical fictions. Even there, I feel like I read that book because it was by Natasha Pulley, not because it was a work of science fiction, if that makes sense. So I definitely want to read more sci-fi and fantasy in 2025 because I really, really love it when I read it, and I just don't end up reaching for it as often. I think partly because sci-fi and fantasy books are often quite long, or they're parts of series, and it just feels like a bigger commitment than like a 350-page work of historical fiction. As I said earlier in the video, I'm not going to be rereading a ton of very long Charles Dickens books on audiobook in 2025, so I'm hoping to kind of replace some of that audiobook time with longer science fiction and fantasy works. That's my sort of vague plan, but anyway. When it comes to modern books from around the world, I have quite a few gaps here. Ticked off all my boxes for the USA, as I kind of knew that I would. That's mostly there to separate the USA from other books, so I don't kind of tick off all my international boxes with books from the US, which, you know, I tend to read a bit more often. I ticked off nearly all my books for Japan, which is nice, though not quite, but I do have quite a lot of gaps in my other section. And again, I do want to read more internationally in 2025 and kind of mix up how I do this challenge. So yes, more on that on Thursday. Moving down to my new releases challenge, my 2024/2025 releases, I ticked off all the boxes exactly, so that's very nice and neat. Looking at my not a novel challenge, a bit of a mix here. So I have quite a lot of gaps, but I don't really mind about any of the gaps. I ticked off all my short story collection goals and all my non-fiction goals, and I even read a comic and a graphic novel, which I didn't have a box for, so I had to write it on in pen. There will be a box for that in 2025. I didn't read as many plays or poetry collections as I wanted to, but that's kind of fine. One of the reasons why my goals for plays, poetry and short stories were very high for 2024 was because I was in a book club where we were reading a play, a poetry collection and a short story every month, and we did that throughout most of 2023, and then we all got really busy and the book club kind of stopped in 2024. So I kind of don't mind that I didn't end up taking off those goals because they were kind of there because of the book club. And then finally, we have my TBR jar pick, where there are many, many gaps, far more gaps than there should be. I'm sad that I didn't manage to read as many things from my physical TBR, my long-term physical TBR, as I wanted to, but you know, that's fine. I'm going to think about my TBR jar in a slightly different way in 2025. So overall, I read a lot of books in 2024, a lot of which were really good. I'm really pleased kind of overall with the amount of reading I did, and the kind of mix of classics and contemporary books that I read in 2024. I didn't do so well with quite a lot of my goals, but that's okay. Like a lot of my goals, as I said, you know, they're a target, they're a challenge, not something I actually expect to achieve. They're there just to sort of guide my reading and to gamify my reading and to have fun with, rather than things I'm really stressing about completing. But I do think for 2025, I want to focus my goals a bit more and think hard about the goals that I really do want to achieve and that do matter to me more. So hopefully there will be a video up with my 2025 reading goals later on this week. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Do let me know, what were your reading goals for 2024? Did you achieve them? Do you enjoy reading goals or not? That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.